Hey y'all, thanks for coming today. I've known Jordan Luff for a few years now. He has a reputation for some impressive forest ecology work. Um, and this work supports native plant health and biodiversity in the landscape. Today he will talk about work he has done and is doing to promote ecological health and integrity at the landscape level. So without further ado, Jordan.
Thanks. Word? Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you, Ruth, and thank you everyone for coming on a really lovely Saturday. So hopefully we get to go outside after this and enjoy the botanical gardens. My name is Jordan Luff. My title is the Southern Blue Ridge Forest Ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in North Carolina. I've been in this position for about a year. I can easily track my time there by the hurricane because I started the week of Hurricane Helene. So thought my job was going to be one thing and then it became something else, but that was going to happen anyway. Before that, I was the management forester at DuPont State Recreational Forest, where forest management there has an emphasis on ecological forestry, managing forest communities. And so I've taken a lot of the principles that and the experience I've had there and applying that here with the Nature Conservancy in across Western North Carolina now, not just in one little part of it. I live in Brevard, so I love all the talk about Silvermont and Brevard and with my family. And yeah, so I'm going to talk to you today about oak conservation and work we're doing in our oak forests. We're going to transition to talking about the importance of oak. Why should we even be considering oak as an important tree species? I'll give a brief history of southern Appalachian forests to kind of give a baseline for what the condition of our forests is like today and why this work is being done. We'll be talking about what we call the oak regeneration crisis, management practices that we're using to address this crisis, and then I will go over a case study of this collaborative work that the Nature Conservancy has been involved in for several years now in North Carolina. It will have some graphs and some figures, but yeah, I'll try to blow through some of that and just kind of talk about what the importance of why that is, and also to emphasize the scientific angle of this work, and then talking about what we'll be doing, what TNC is doing moving forward with that. So, in terms of the importance of oak, I'd say one of the most important characteristics of oak is its genetic diversity. The genus Quercus is about 60 million years old, so it's one of the oldest genus of woody species in the world, and it's also highly diverse. There are over 450 species oak worldwide, and in the North America, we have about 90, which is pretty incredible. And they range anywhere from large oak, like large white oak trees, to kind of shrubby species, deciduous to evergreen. And in terms of their habitat type, they can range anywhere from what we know as our temperate woodlands to Mediterranean semi-deserts to subtropical rainforests. Um, Total tree lifespans by species in our region generally range from about 90 to 120 years old, to some species like white oak can live up to 400 to 600 years old. And a lot of what we do in oak management really emphasizes white oak because it's kind of a catch-all, because it's one of the most important oak species we have. And so a lot of times we'll kind of focus on white oak, but what we're really referring to that as a catch-all for all oaks. And so here's just a brief map showing the kind of the dispersion of different species density in the contiguous U.S., with this brown color being no oak species. But if you can pay attention to kind of the central hardwoods region and the southeast, that's where a lot of the diversity in the U.S. is for oak species. So anywhere from 15 to 20 species in those darkest green spots there. So along the Mississippi, eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, even southern Alabama having some of the most diversity of oak species. In Western North Carolina, or in the Southern Appalachians, our region, we have close to a dozen. And oak is also dominant or co-dominant across over 6 million acres of our Southern Blue Ridge forest communities. So all of the colors here that you see on this map represent an ecological zone, as we define it, or an ecotype of forest that is where oak is a primary component of that. So oak pine, oak hickory, and the like. Here's just a few of the different oak species that we see in our forest types, or in our region here. White oak being one of the most important in the white oak group, and then the red oak group. We have northern red oak and some of these other oaks here as well. So almost a dozen, not quite. But these are the most common ones that we see here. With the bottom ones here, dwarf chinkapin oak, shingle oak, probably being less common until you get into more specific areas. And it has oaks in general have a high water use efficiency compared to other species. They're intermediate in shade tolerance, which gives them a bit of an advantage. In some cases, they're very tolerant of certain environmental stressors like drought, fire, and nutrient deficiencies. And they have these deep roots that can access groundwater and also provide structural support. They support over 500 species of caterpillars. If you've ever read the book, The Nature of Oaks by Doug Tallamy, then you're recognizing some of these figures that I obviously stole from. But what the importance of this fact is that oaks are the basis of a incredible food web that supports unparalleled biodiversity compared to other tree species. Even the next tree species, in terms of the number of species that oaks that they support, is not even close to what oaks can support. Again, I stole that from Doug Tallamy. Additionally, there's about 600 species of gall wasps and sawflies and other hymenopterans that exclusively use oaks as a host plant, and then about 60 species of wood-boring beetles. So I could go on and on and on, but the important fact is that oak, unlike many other tree species in our woods, support unparalleled biodiversity. Here's just an image of some really cute oakworm moths, just to give you an idea of just a little taste of some of that diversity in terms of the caterpillars and moths. It probably has a lot to do with the age of the genus, and a lot of these species have probably evolved over time with that. And speaking of which, we'll refer to jays, specifically our blue jay. This species, jays in general, but our blue jays have also evolved with oaks. Their genus is about 60 million years old as well. Again, another Doug Tallamy fact. Along with jays, oak acorns support about 60 species of songbirds and 40 species of mammals. But blue jays specifically are important because of that evolutionary parallel, in that they can collect and store over 4,000 acorns a year, of which they'll remember about a quarter of them. So one of the most important dispersers of oak acorns and oaks across their native range are jays. They're the best tree planter crew that we could ever have as a forester. The cool thing about blue jays too is that they have developed this special hook on their beak to be able to break into acorns. And then they have an enlarged esophagus, so they can actually store about 5 acorns in their throat at a time. So really cool. Yeah. Really read that book because it's really cool. Making a good case for Doug. And in terms of other benefits of acorns, the acorns are an important source of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, particularly for those species wildlife looking for food in the fall and the winter. In pre-colonial history, acorns were an important source of food for Native Americans. So that would mean our Cherokee indigenous stewards here in Western North Carolina. And other parts of the tree were used for things like fuel, for structures, basket making, medicines. The bark was used to produce medicines, among other things. Today, the wood is highly valued. You can make stave barrels for bourbon. So the bourbon industry has a big interest, particularly in Kentucky, for managing for white oak. But also other barrels for spirits, furniture, cabinets, floors, boats, whatever. So there's a lot, not just an ecological value, but a strong economic incentive for oak forests. But it's probably also part of the reason why we're in some of the issues that we have today with oak. Oak, particularly white oak, is projected to fare comparatively better under warmer and drier climate. And it's able to, so I'm describing the figures here. On the left-hand side is the current extent of white oak in terms of abundance, with the blue meaning higher abundance, higher density of species of individuals across its native range is outlined in red here. And this is using U.S. Forest Service FIA data. On the right here is in pink is kind of the current extent, and then in blue and yellow are these low probability to high probability, respectively, of its white oak's ability to expand its range in 100 years under the strongest climate emission scenario. And so what this means essentially is that in 100 years, white oak is projected to expand its range outward, like in the south, towards the west, but potentially upslope in these high elevation, like here on the spine of the Appalachian Trail here, and up into these high elevation mountains here. There's a lower probability relative to other areas, but even potentially up into the northeast. Armin. What? This is white oak specifically. Yeah, yeah. Again, using white oak as kind of a catch-all. Yeah. Species, white oak species, correct. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's a ton. There's a ton of different species in that group. Yeah. And last thing to mention, white because again specifically white oak lives so long, and many other long-lived oaks have the ability to store more carbon over a longer period of time compared to other species. So tying that back to the climate change factor. And then oak is not only adapted to fire and tolerant of low intensity surface fire, it's actually adapted to rely on that fire as a disturbance that helps it outcompete faster growing species. And we'll touch a little bit on that, the fire angle here in a second. So we'll move into that really condensed history of Southern Appalachian forests. But we're going to go back 12,000 years, just real quick, talking about the end of the Paleolithic era, where we have these Paleolithic peoples that have inhabited the Southern Appalachians, the Laurentide ice sheet that was extended down as far south as Pennsylvania has begun to decline and collapse. The boreal species that once encompassed all of North Carolina are now moving northward and up in elevation. So our spruce sky islands, if you're familiar with your spruce fir forests, they're a remnant of that. And then our mixed hardwoods and pines start to move northward and at the lower elevations. And then we have this, the Native American habitation of the landscape, where they are relying on the land for hunting, plant gathering, fishing, and other freshwater sources. They are regularly moving their home sites to utilize rich, fertile soils for agriculture, creating kind of a mosaic across the landscape of cleared open areas that they then abandon and allow to go fallow and regenerate naturally. And then in this era of indigenous stewardship, they're of course driven by subsistence and reliance on the forest. They're actually managing the landscape around them for their benefit, but also with a deep understanding of the ecological relationship that they share with the land. They refer to what we call natural resources as their natural relatives. But they girdled trees, cut them down, burned vegetation to clear land for crops and home sites. They used the trees for structures, tools, and fuel, cultivated plants for food and medicine, and in some cases used wild plants for medicine and food as well, and burned the forests on an average, 1 to 2 years. Some people say it's a little bit longer than that, depending on where you're standing. And then enter colonization. So prior to the 19th century, we have the beginning of the displacement of Native Americans in our region, specifically. Widespread deforestation begins. So if you look at this graph here on my left, your right, you see the extent of pre-colonial forest in green in 1620 at the top, transitioning to 1850 here in the middle. So you can see from the northeast to the eastern seaboard, that large-scale clearing of the forest landscape, and across some of the more riverine areas in the central U.S. as well. And most of this wood, prior to American independence, was shipped to Europe, or to England specifically, as many know, and agrarian settlement, interestingly enough, continues burning. So fire doesn't just immediately disappear on the landscape. Many farmers and settlers were using fire as a tool that they were learned from the indigenous people that taught them. Over time, Native Americans are largely displaced from the lands that they used to live on, and we see the rise of timber barons, the logging industry. It's where we start to transition down into kind of that bottom image there on the figure that represents 1920. Many acres of eastern forests are completely cleared and burned and converted to agriculture. And what areas are not completely cleared are selectively cut, which is a fun term that is still used today that doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means, but what we as foresters or land managers view as taking the best and leaving the rest. So it's a selectively removing large trees. Another term is high grading, where they, exactly. So here's a image of some of those land practices. In 1923, this was Mount Mitchell. Pretty amazing to think of what Mount Mitchell looks like today, considering what happened here just 100 years ago. Not meant to be doom and gloom, guys, sorry, but sometimes history is a little upsetting. So as we enter the 20th century, logging scales up, trees get smaller, right? A lot of those large trees have been cut down. Species demands shift. The Biltmore School of Forestry is established to help address the depleted resource of trees and of wood. And the U.S. Forest Service and state forestry agencies are created to protect forest resources in the U.S. And we'll move into fire suppression, which is a policy that the U.S. Forest Service and our state agencies enact in about the 1920s or 30s that essentially changes the landscape writ large. American chestnut trees are wiped out. Deforestation continues for agriculture and development. And we see the impacts of introduced plants, animals, and pathogens, how they impact farms and our native ecosystems. And so our southern Appalachian forests today are they're a remnant of all of this history, right? They've experienced these just kind of shocking changes in a relatively short period of time, and in prior to that colonial history, a kind of steady stewardship by, well, it's probably not fair to say steady, but a stewardship by indigenous peoples for thousands of years up to that. So I mentioned that really just to kind of point out how resilient our forests are because of what they've endured. And so today we recognize, using U.S. Forest Service term ecological zones or ecozones, of these different forest types here, or different forest ecozones across our mountain landscape. So from the spruce fir and our balds up on the top, highest elevations, to these cove forests and our fire-adapted forests here, circled in red. I did put a little orange one on top of the grassy bald because there's a lot of debate about, is this fire? Is it because of fire? Is it because of grazing? Is it both? I don't know. I'm just contributing to the dialogue. And so our oak forest types, all fire adapted. Even our pine oak forests here, right there, those are all fire adapted. Today, that brings us to the oak regeneration crisis. Today, most of our oak forests look like this, where they still have mature or intermediate mature oaks in the overstory. They're even-aged, meaning they generally regenerated around the same time. Most of the trees in the overstory are within 10 to 20 years old of each other. And in the understory, or the midstory, below that main canopy, it's mainly shade-tolerant trees, evergreen shrubs or deciduous shrubs. And this is a result of that policy of fire exclusion, right? So that lack of fire on the landscape has created a process called mesification that I'll touch on in a minute that has basically removed the sunlight from these open oak forests, and they're starting to transition. And so this graph here kind of depicts that early 20th century, what the forest looked like, where it wasn't completely cleared out, these oak and pine forests, where they're starting to become more dense, and the species are more shade tolerant, they're more moisture dependent, they're less flammable. And so again, this is just depicting this conversion of these fire adapted oak forests to forests that are less adapted to fire, they're less open, they have less diverse understories, and we don't really know what that's going to look like in the future. This is just another graph kind of showing how these species perpetuate this fire adaptability and flammability, where our oak trees have more open crowns, rougher bark, deeper rooting zones, drier, fluffier leaf litter that promote fire. In our what we call the mesophytes, or your more moisture dependent trees like red maple and yellow poplar, have deeper, denser crowns that cast more shade. Their leaf litter is less flammable, and their root systems are more shallow. And so we're, again, this transition from more open forests across the central hardwood zone to these denser, less fire adapted forests. So some of those mesic species, I mentioned red maple, the sugar maple, poplar, white pine, smaller trees like sourwood and silverbell, and our evergreen shrubs, everybody's favorite mountain laurel and rhododendron. And as a forester, those are like the hardest species that I ever have to deal with. But I do want to also mention that like these all have a place, right? They have intrinsic value, they have ecological value. And we're not talking about eliminating these from our forests, but we are talking about trying to combat them in places, oak forests and these oak forest sites, where they're starting to expand into and take over because of that history that we talked about, that land management history. Yes, question.
It's more fire resistant. Looks like some of those wouldn't be right. Birch.
They are not fire resistant, right? Well, laurel, we'll talk about laurel. As far as fire, laurel is not fire resistant, but when you burn laurel, it essentially, especially in March and April, it lights up like gasoline and it top kills, and then it sprouts back aggressively. So they've adapted in different ways, but not in the same way that we're talking about fire resistance the way that oak is. So the characteristics of some of these mesic species, they use a lot more water, which is important in terms of how that affects people down below the watersheds, right? They are typically shade tolerant except for poplar, faster growing. Their leaf litter is less flammable, as I mentioned. They are less tolerant of environmental stressors, generally speaking. Again, in comparison to oak. So they like more quality sites. They don't do as well compared to oak on drier sites. But they do kind of perpetuate the conditions that they need to exist too when they do start to colonize what would typically be drier sites like ridges and south-facing slopes where oak has tended and historically been dominated. And also relative to oaks, they provide less food for wildlife. And so all of that leading up to today, this has all happened before the new era that we in Western North Carolina live in. And then we get hit by Helene. And so I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty of Helene because most of us in the room probably experienced this. But Helene has probably more than ever really opened my eyes and other experts' eyes to how important this conservation work is, because most of the forests that were impacted by Helene across our landscape were oak-dominated forests. Oak trees, generally speaking, we don't have hard data yet, but observationally and as far as we can tell, oak trees were most knocked down by Helene. And I can talk a little bit about why we think that is, if somebody remembers to ask me later. But what we are now what we now have is in many places this condition where we had these oak forests, but we didn't have oak regenerating in the understory. And now the oak forests have toppled down. And what comes next? Most likely red maple poplar, the fast tracking of that conversion that we were concerned about already, and non-native invasive species. So there's two factors that we're trying to address with our oak restoration work. The first one is structure. So the number of trees in a forest, the sizes of those trees, girth and heights. And what mesification has done is converting these open forests, these open canopy conditions where there's more sunlight, there's less trees in the overstory, but there's more herbaceous growth and grasses in the understory, is transitioning to that closed canopy forest where there's less diversity in the understory, more trees in the overstory, sucking up more water. And we want to reverse that back to more open forest type where appropriate. And then the second factor is composition, specifically in terms of regeneration. So this nice little bank of oak regeneration here is uncommon in oak forests. And that's what we want to start to address is we can establish this, but then we also need to advance this or recruit these young seedlings into the next stages of development so that they can eventually ascend to the canopy. And so this is an image from my work at DuPont where we were able to establish oak regeneration, and it's kind of a brown reddish mess, so apologies for that. But one thing that I like about this photo is that as the leaves are starting to fall, you can see exactly where all the oak is and where we established oak regeneration just using fire. But what fire doesn't do is get that oak competitive up to the mid-story, doesn't help it out compete red maple and poplar because those species also get top killed and sprout. But we can at least establish it in the understory using fire. Yeah. It is in a lot of places. Most of Western North Carolina is not as big of a problem. There are definitely places where deer browse becomes an issue, but our deer populations are not as abundant, say, just a few hours east of here and a few hours west or in the south or the north, where in Pennsylvania to Wisconsin to Vermont, they have incredible deer browse issues. So I'm not going to address that today just because it's not one that, thankfully, I have to worry about and have to deal with maybe one day, especially if we create more deer habitat. But anyway. Again, this is an example of establishing of oak regeneration using multiple burns. But without an active plan or a pathway forward, this oak will just sit here in the understory until it dies. So let's talk about what we do to get it out of that stage and up into the canopy. So I'm going to just focus just on what we call like non-commercial practices, mainly just because all of any timber harvest methods that you use still require a lot of tending beforehand in order to get oak to the place where it can become a canopy tree. So it's really, to my mind, what happens at the end of like a stand age or stand rotation is not important unless you do the work ahead of time to get that oak to a competitive stage. So I talked about fire. Historically, fire occurred very frequently, mostly low intensity, except in more piney spots. And it's good at maintaining fire adapted species like oak and reducing fire intolerant species, or at least top killing them. Over, again, many hundreds, if not thousands of years, that fire has been one of the primary tools that the Cherokee and other indigenous peoples used to create these historical conditions that allowed oak to become a dominant species. And fire is most successful on drier sites. Historically, before we had bulldozers and hand tools to dig fire lines and had developments that we had to protect during controlled burn operations, fires were stopped by streams, by wet forest types, by spruce forest, all these different like kind of more mesic forests. That's where the fire would hit in under most conditions and then stop, and then would burn through these dry places. Fire, to that end, is a blunt tool, best used for maintenance, difficult to use in restoration, except under certain circumstances. So it's not a silver bullet, unlike what some fire practitioners would love it to be. This tool is called mid-story reduction. And so I'm going to talk a lot more about mid-story reduction in the case study. But this is more of a targeted or surgical application. Unlike fire being a blunt tool, this is a surgical tool where we're partially replicating the effects of fire, but we're also killing the root system. So where fire top kills trees, they are all generally resprout, like red maple and yellow poplar, very aggressively and vigorously. By creating a small wound in the tree and surgically applying a small amount of herbicide to that tree, it goes into the root systems and deadens the tree, and then we leave that dead tree standing to be a dead tree for all the values that provides in the woods. And that also allows us to turn the dial up on sunlight. So if you can imagine, if you could take a light switch, one of those like light knobs, where you just turn it up just a little bit, right? So we want to get it to that sweet spot, which is about 20 to 40% sunlight in the forest. Too little and oak doesn't respond. Too much, and all those other species that are competing against it respond. So that's kind of the sweet spot according to the literature. This practice requires very solid tree identification skills. So it requires crews that are very skilled and experienced or can be trained, especially if you're reserving more than oak. So typically when the Nature Conservancy is applying this practice, we have a lot of tree species and shrub species that we don't want targeted because of the various values that they provide, whether it's for wildlife, like serviceberry, for example. I'm always keeping serviceberry or dogwood in the understory of a forest, generally because those don't get abundant enough to be competitive against oak. And in some places, there's other factors there. Most useful on productive sites where you have these density issues and this competition issues. Crown touch release is a really fun practice where you kind of thinning trees that are directly adjacent to desirable trees. Another term for this is crop tree release, but at the Nature Conservancy, we are moving away from commodification of our forests. So we like to try to use more ecological terms. And it also is more descriptive of what we're doing. So essentially, if you have a wonderful, beautiful white oak right here, and you want to release it from competition, allow it to grow bigger and better, and persist into the future, any crown of a tree surrounding it that touches the crown of this white oak was what gets thinned. And that allows that oak tree, the selected tree, to expand its crown, create more leaves, capture more sunlight, and then also grow in size, produce more acorns, etc. Typically applied when the stand is young, 15 to 30 years old, but also there's evidence from the University of Kentucky that more mature oaks can also respond from release in this way. So we were doing a lot of this in more mature forests at DuPont, for example, and at one of our preserves in Ashe County with the Nature Conservancy. And so this also helps kind of push, I talked about structure earlier, push some of these oak stands to that more open condition because you're thinning more trees, sometimes more overstory trees too. Whereas the last practice, the mid-story reduction, doesn't thin out many overstory trees. This is what this looks like on the landscape, just a fun little diagram. These are trees that we're releasing here in the light brown. These are the trees that are deadened, and then there's all the trees around them that don't get touched here. So, and this is again just to really help ensure that you have like a select number, some anywhere from like 20 to 40 trees an acre that are going to get bigger and persist into the future. This is also a tool that's often used to push forests, that younger forests, into old forest conditions. So not necessarily old growth because we're dealing with a lot of degraded forests, but when we want to see certain trees that have the characteristics to live long and get really, really big, we're helping fast forward those characteristics for them. And then this is weeding. It's kind of a weird silvicultural term here, but really this is done with stands that are less than 15 years old, especially with planted stands where we are planting shortleaf pine or sometimes planting white oak, where you come in and you just often with like a brush cutter or a chainsaw, just releasing the best growing trees around, releasing them from competing trees, and when the stand is like really, really thick with small stems. This just ensures survival of your healthiest and most vigorous individuals by releasing them from competition. Had a question in the back? Yeah.
I was mostly just going to add on to your previous point that maybe, or ask if the end goal or objective of this ties into previous land management, such as having and now we have these even age stands, so that is why we're doing this.
You mean like diversification of like, yeah, age and structure? Yeah. So, yeah, one of the benefits is kind of more tangential, like a side benefit of doing a lot of this work is not just increasing diversity of structure, but also different ages in the forest, right? Because if we have these mostly even-aged forests, they don't have a lot of complexity. By creating more chaos and more complexity, we can create those different age classes by opening the forest up, getting more sunlight in there, which does increase their resilience and make them a lot healthier than they were.
That's your last point there. It increases sunlight historical.
Yeah. Yes.
What do you consider the crop tree? Is that the one you're encouraging to grow?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you're oak.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the darker trees there.
Yeah.
More mature.
They're usually the same age and sometimes the same species as these other trees. They're just usually we select what would be a crop tree or a tree targeted for release by certain characteristics. So is it taller? Does it have a good full crown? Is it straighter? Does it have less healthy like defects, right?
Giant pumpkin.
Yes. The giant. I like that. Nothing in this scenario, in this particular situation, nothing happens to them. They're left alone. Just the trees here whose crowns are directly competing with these get deadened. Now, hopefully, we're using this practice in conjunction with controlled burning, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. In which case, they eventually may start to get thinned out over time. Yeah.
Already thin.
Mhm.
Or what was the other?
Or hack and squirt. Yeah. And so that moves into our case study. So in 2021, the Nature Conservancy and the North Carolina Forest Service entered into an agreement to practice several silvicultural methods that were funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society and their Climate Adaptation Fund, with the goal of restoring composition and structure of fire-adapted forests in order to increase resilience under changing climate, and then to be able to share these techniques with other land managers, in the hopes that what we do actually gets us to the desired conditions that we're managing for. So it's tough when we're working with trees and forests, we're talking about things that happen on the scale outside of human lives. So a 3-year funded grant project, there's not a lot to see early on, but we can at least share what we've learned early on and then continue to monitor these treatments going forward. So we've installed permanent monitoring plots in a lot of these places that we're going to continue to monitor and then share, like at our Fire Learning Network meetings and with partners going forward. So again, this work is using the same practices that I just touched on, but we used all of these practices with fire, right? So the idea wasn't to just burn some places, just do mid-story in some places, just do crown touch release in some places, but to try to show the benefits of combining these practices together where appropriate. So our 3 project sites are located on the southern Blue Ridge Escarpment. They are all relatively similar, heavily disturbed forests, oak dominated, similar moisture regimes. We have DuPont State Forest here, Headwater State Forest here, right on the state line, and then the Nature Conservancy's Silver Run Preserve just south of Cashers, North Carolina here. And so our goal was to burn nearly 3,000 acres, treat about 900 acres with these restoration practices that I just described, and to plant over 100 acres of fire-adapted tree species. And so we did that. We burned nearly 2,800 acres across these 3 forests over 3 years. We conducted over 988 acres of those restoration practices, mostly mid-story reduction in burn units. And we planted over 100 acres of white oak, shortleaf pine, and pitch pine across all 3 of those sites over 3 years. Yeah. So zeroing in just on one of those sites at Headwater State Forest, to give you a little bit of a background on this project. Here, this image is a before and after of one plot, before the treatments applied and then after the treatments applied. And so this site in particular had been burned once before, a couple years before we entered into this agreement. And then before we resampled it, it got a mid-story reduction as evidenced by the skull and also burned a second time. So by the end of this project, this stand had been burned twice, and had also received a mid-story treatment. So one burn, second burn, and a mid-story. So you can see just from the image here that increase in sunlight. You can see what was green on this side is there's a lot more, there's some more dead trees, a lot more sunlight coming through, but not a ton. There's still a lot of shady spots in here because that treatment is not targeting a lot of canopy trees, a lot of large trees. And so looking at some of the numbers, we had a 74% decrease in the number of mid-story trees of mesic species, so red maple, poplar, other species like that. Very little effects on the overstory. Any effects on the overstory likely from either small overstory trees getting treated or from the fire itself. It actually had a bump in overstory trees, so probably certain oaks and in the red one here, this is other fire adapted trees. That's like oak, hickories, and pitch pine, shortleaf pine, probably just ingrowth from before, not a direct cause from the treatment. But and then if we're looking just at changes to the mid-story, just looking at our mesic species, ignore the typo, we had a 64% decrease in red maple, all yellow poplars, 80% of sourwood, and 84% of black gum. But this figure here on the bar graph is really interesting to me because we had a 232% increase in snags of just mid-story sized trees. And I should have mentioned this before, but we were targeting trees that were under 12 inches in diameter. So, smaller than this. That's the easiest way to kind of prescribe that to contractors. But generally, trees over 12 inches aren't overstory trees. So we're really just trying to get them to target those smaller trees in height as well. What we're mainly going for.
Snakes.
Dead trees of all species. Yeah, we really like dead trees. I know that's like seems counterintuitive. We like live trees, but we also like dead trees too. They also provide a lot of benefit to wildlife in the forest as well. So we're keeping them in there. And then going back to sunlight. So I mentioned that that sweet spot for sunlight is between 20 and 40%. So this stand, we didn't know this before we added it to the list, was already kind of in that sweet spot. But and then when we did the treatments, we really got a lot of sunlight. So we went from 31% to 59% sunlight. So we increased it about 28%. But what we did show is that this treatment does have the right effect. We are able to turn the dial on that sunlight up in at least at a rate that we want to. Next time, maybe we'll do the sunlight measurements before, so we know not to do that there. But anyway, it still needed it because there's still a lot of, mid-story competition. But anyway. And then probably the most important thing that we learned from this, if you're looking at just each treatment siloed or alone, they both have impacts on the blue color being the mesic or non-oak species. They both impact those trees, but when combined have the most impact. In fact, fire decreased oaks and hickories as well. The mid-story treatment didn't really impact them at all, but the most impact to the mid-story species, the mid-story mesic species, was using both of those treatments together, the fire and the mid-story reduction. So that's collectively, it says FA, that's fire adapted, that's hickories, pitch pines, and other non-oak species that we're trying to benefit. Ruth. I did not mention that, which is I should have. So the treatments or the measurements typically occurred right after the treatment. So they were all done in the growing season, all done in June. So you could get similar photos, similar site conditions that would occur over time. And so one thing that we've learned too from this treatment is that, especially when we're doing the mid-story reduction in the fall, is it takes a few years for all of the trees species to be affected. So red maple, typically, we would treat it in the fall, and because it's just easier to do this stuff in the fall. There's less yellow jackets, less snakes. It's nicer to be outside, right? But it's a little slower for that mid-story reduction to take effect. Red maple would usually be dead in the summer. It would take Fraser magnolia or sourwood 2 summers to die. So some of those species like really hung on, right? And I'm sorry to my friends that love sourwood. I love sourwood too, but I promise we were only doing the small ones. We had monster sourwood in there that were not touched. Anyway, but so one thing that we are hoping to pick up on with another sampling of these monitoring plots at year 5 is the full efficacy of this treatment. So right now we're getting a taste of where the direction of these forests are going with the treatment early on, but over time we're going to continue to sample these and see what the full effects are, especially as we continue to use fire, right? Fire is not a one and done deal. Otherwise you just kind of reset things and then the red maple comes back as stronger and thicker than ever. So we continue to use fire to try to maintain these fire adapted systems. But hopefully just the mid-story reduction, the idea is that we just use it once and then walk away. Well, except for fire. Yeah.
Keep the fire. How do you determine how often you do that? Are you judging it based on some variable like this, or are you just going in and saying, okay, we're going to do this every other year?
So there's a lot of different ways to do this. So a lot of our forest types kind of have an average fire return interval, how many times you burn it based on the number of years, like how many years in between each burn. That's all been just heavily researched by fire ecologists and other forest ecologists. So we're really relying on the literature, on the scientific research that's already been done to tell us how frequently should we burn. When when you're actually a land manager or a practitioner, you're much more constrained by a lot of other non-ecological things. Like number of like people that winds, yeah, environmental conditions. Are we in a bad fire year? And so that shuts down all controlled burning because you got to go fight fires. But realistically, what we aimed for, particularly when we kind of think of fire in using fire in a forest under two regimes, a restoration regime and then a maintenance regime. So you have to do the restoration first because the forest hasn't seen fire in a number of decades. And then once you have had fire in there for a number of times, then you're in kind of maintenance phase, right? And so we were targeting 3 burns within 15 years. And generally speaking, we were getting 3 burns within 10 to 12 years, realistically. So fairly successful. Once we hit about 3 years and 15 years, on average, we were finding we were kind of getting out of that restoration phase where the forest the understory is changing in a way that you're starting to see those historical elements of more grasses coming up. You're getting a little bit more sunlight because you're continuing to keep the mid-story top killed with the fire, and you're getting more herbaceous growth in the understory too. So these are species that have been in the seed bank for thousands of years, which is incredible to think about because oak only lasts for about a year, the acorns, and then they're no good. Whereas a lot of grasses, and not just seed bank, but their rhizomes, their root systems can last and just sit there and wait for sunlight for a long time. I don't know enough about any of that stuff, but I know at least how to use fire to respond to them. Yeah.
Quick question about this figure one more time.
Okay.
I'm curious what your explanation. So the combined has less percent change than the fire. So, and from looking at this, I feel like the fire and the mid-story should be combined at the combined. So essentially you should have about -0.4% change in the combined. I'm curious what your explanation is.
So what this is showing is under fire, we did have a lot of dieback from oak stems in the mid-story, from hickory stems in the mid-story, and some dieback from mesic stems in the mid-story, about 22%. The combined treatment had some impacts to oaks and hickories, but more impacts to mesic stems.
If you applied fire to the combined as well, shouldn't it have
It did have fire. Combined is fire and mid-story.
Yeah.
These are three separate plots.
Correct.
This is not one.
These are three yeah. This is collective of 3 different of areas. Yeah. So this is like several sites of just fire, several sites of just mid-story treatments, and then several sites of combined treatments. It's a comparison of places where we only used fire, only used mid-story, and then in some different places where we used both.
Fire only and the impact of
Yeah.
oak, that's the negative 0.38, some 38% is.
It's a reduction in those oaks, yeah.
So it's what you decide.
Well, so it's a side effect of fire because again, fire is a blunt tool. And what we're seeing, especially in the first time you burn and the second time you burn, you lose a lot of oak and hickory in the mid-story, the smaller stems, because those trees have not gotten large enough they haven't gotten thick enough bark to withstand that low intensity surface fire. They will resprout, and the maples and the poplars will also resprout. So we're not like losing them under the fire scenario, but we are losing that above ground growth on all of those combined.
The deal of the 3, is that yes or no?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we still lost some on average. It was lower. Partly it may have to do too with like some of these sites where we're doing combined treatments. We were on our like second or third burn with some of them as well. So it's kind of hard to parse out like which sites were first burns and which ones were second and third burns. Because then just kind of run out of data pretty quick. But yeah, yes.
Was there any consideration of the release of non-native invasive species?
100%. Yeah. So we didn't cover that, but in all of our treatments, I can at least speak to what we've done with the Nature Conservancy in the North Carolina Forest Service. We were pre-treating for invasives before. None of these sites had extensive invasive problems. They just kind of had, on the containment lines, which were usually roads and trails. So it was like sparse spot treating on the edges of these places. And then after treatment, after we burned or after we did mid-story reduction, coming back in a second or a third time and treating again. By treating but non-native invasives, mean like using herbicide to kill them. The invasives.
The vines up in the tree.
Well, we can use like cut stem on some of the vines where we just like cut the vine and just targeted treatment on the vine there. Stuff like that. I mean, it just depends on what was there. But none of our sites had, thankfully, had very extensive invasive problems. Again, just mostly kind of on the edges of these units, and they were therefore very easy to control invasives. But invasive control was always been something that we took seriously. We accounted for the number of acres of non-native invasive treatments that we were doing. And most of that looked like either targeted herbicide treatments like cut stem or hack and squirt or foliar spray if necessary. Chinese silvergrass was one that came up now and again in some places, particularly in burned areas that had already been burned. So we would foliar spray those in some cases. Yeah. All right. So our lesson learned with this treatment was combine them when possible. It's not always possible for everyone, right? So if we're talking about trying to apply these practices on private lands, not every private landowner can use fire. There's a lot of restrictions in a lot of places, a lot of factors to consider, but at least in more extensive forested areas, using both of these tools together was found to be the most successful. And when thinking about, we've kind of talked about this with we had some side effects from the burning with losing some of our smaller oaks, but eventually, once we get oak established in these sites with using these tools, you have to consider pausing burning for a period of time. So oak typically needs to get 2 to 4 inches in diameter in order to be thick enough to withstand fire. And then eventually needs to be released. So once we are able to get oak established and then advanced enough into what we call the mid-story position, it then eventually needs to be released. So that may look like deadening trees above it, if necessary, allowing nature to take those trees over time. But it is important to consider that those mid-story trees will die eventually if they don't get full sunlight. So going back to oak being kind of intermediate in shade tolerance, it can handle partial shade for a period of time, but not forever. So to summarize, what we've talked about today, oak is a keystone species. It's, again, it's one of the oldest and most genetically diverse genus of trees, uses 4 times less water than maples and poplars, and serves as the basis of a massive food web. Oak dominance was shaped by indigenous stewardship using fire, and it's the fire suppression exclusion policies, post-European colonization that have put oak under crisis, and combined with extensive logging and land clearing. And without further intervention, we will continue to lose oak forests in the future. And what that future looks like is really uncertain, right? And so we know that oak is more resilient to changing climate, and the species that are replacing it are less resilient to we don't know exactly what those forests will look like when in 100 years, 200 years. And so there's a lot of concern about what will happen. And so moving forward, the Nature Conservancy continues to support and try to push our public agency partners to practice more oak conservation work. We're practicing at our own preserves, and we're continuing to monitor those monitoring plots and providing that information to the public and to our partners. We're also working with a multi-agency, multi-state development team on a oak practitioner's guidance for Appalachian oak forests, ranging from at least Ohio to North Carolina, and to help try to provide both landowners and land managers with a suite of tools to prepare them for how to regenerate oak forests and get the results that they are looking for to keep oak forests oak. And we're also working with the U.S. Forest Service on how to address impacts from Helene on our oak forests and determine, like, what do we do here? I don't know. I don't have all the answers. We're still trying to figure this out. Again, this is a collaborative effort. In some cases, we may let this go. In some cases, we may need to take direct action. Certainly, the biggest issues on top of the conversion of oak forests to non-oak are non-native invasive species, which on the national forest is probably one of the biggest issues because they have a lot of invasive plant issues, as I'm sure many of you all know. We have gotten more mid-story reduction treatments on at our Silver Run Preserve. So this was part of that original suite of treatments as part of the grant. And then following the completion of that grant, we've added more units of mid-story reduction. We'll be creating burn units here, and we've got more permanent monitoring plots. So we'll be able to continue to add to that story and have more data. And then this is one of our preserves up in Ashe County, where our fire crew is putting in new burn units on a place called Phoenix Mountain, and I'm already laying out and adding mid-story reduction units and a crown touch release unit here, so that we can continue to steward our oak forests and help them out. And with that, thank you for your time and appreciate your attention and your wonderful questions. And if I have more time, we'll take more. Yes.
This is a part of the land that you're designated to be stewards of, but the entrance to the Pisgah National Forest there in Brevard.
Mhm.
What's your assessment of the controlled burn that they did there? A year or so ago?
Yeah. I don't know any details about it. I would say likely the main target of the burn was probably the upper portions of that area where it's probably more oak dominated. And then the fire, generally speaking, when laying out burn units, you use roads and coves and streams as containment lines where possible. Otherwise, you have to use bulldozers or dig hand line in, and that can be. You try to avoid that as much as possible because it disturbs the landscape more extensively. I think that probably if I was going to criticize that at all, I would say it's mainly they should have done more extensive invasive treatment there before burning it. There's a whole lot of kudzu right there. The Pisgah Conservancy is actually targeting that area right now for kudzu treatment. They've done a lot in there already. But as far as assessing that particular area, I mean, I don't have any particular comments about that because I don't know enough about it. I would assume that it's tied to a much larger. The U.S. Forest Service, their burn units are anywhere from 1,000 acres to 5,000 acres in size because they've got quite a bit of land base there. And so oftentimes they're kind of replicating more probably what would have happened historically by starting to burn up on high elevations and letting that fire back down to lower places. So yeah, that's as much as I got for that. Yes.
Is there anything we can do as landowners to help the forest growth?
Absolutely. So, I mean, whether you have an acre or, several, dozen acres or so or more, knowing what's in your woods, knowing what type of forest you have, Is it an oak forest? Is oak meant to be there? And then learning how you can steward that oak and keep it so that when the oak that's in the overstory eventually goes, or any other trees go, that there's oak there to replace it. So you obviously can't use every single tool. Like, we talked about how using both burning and the thinning is most beneficial. That's not practical for everyone because of the way that our developments are established today. But we can still use some of the tools in our toolbox. Working with either a forester or other type of ecologist or conservationist, there's a lot of consultants that can help with that work. And so I would recommend talking to, either a forester or someone else that can help you do that. I'd say some of the most success I've seen with that with private landowners are folks who just take that into their own hands too. If you have enough passion about it and are able, like, going out and learning how to do this stuff on your own, it's actually really fun to go out and do this work. It's probably the best part of my day. As long as I'm not in front of a computer, I'm having a good time. But I find that's more and more as I'm spending more and more time in front of a computer. But if I can go out in the woods and be doing good, especially for our oaks, then it's very fulfilling. All right, I think, is that it? Thanks.